Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review, and in this video I'm going to review Promises by Floating Points, Pharoah and the London Symphony Orchestra. I know that it took me a while to make this review. This is an album that was released about a month ago, and it was an album that it took me a while to listen to it, and I also wanted to just put a bit of a more time to it, to just fully process what the album has to offer. This is one of those occasions where I find an album where I feel that there is a lot to digest, and it's one of those certain occasions where one or two listens is not that enough. There was certainly a lot to unpack here, and I just wanted to just put a bit of time to it to just see how I was going to approach this album and what type of review I was going to make. Because when it comes to jazz and classical music, this is a field that I enjoy, but I don't have that much of a knowledge behind the certain process in those genres, which is certainly in higher regards compared to basically most of the music stuff out there. So when it comes to jazz or classical music, this is a field where I feel sort of a pleb, so do not expect a review from the perspective of someone who knows a lot about compositions or jazz or classical music structures. This mostly comes from a perspective of a casual listener who just enjoys listening to music. And regardless of what I have to say about this album or what my final verdict out of this review is going to be, this is an album that in my opinion everyone should experience at least once. This is one of those albums that I personally feel that it's of high significance. It's a piece of art, it's a piece of music that in my opinion many people should experience at least once. There is something special about this piece and certain characteristics that I truly feel anyone can appreciate. I already see this album just making big numbers and I think that it totally deserves it. I really get the hype behind this album. I really get why this is already considered such an important piece of music, and I can already feel that this album has a great potential of becoming a classic in a few years down the road. Just considering the combination of artists behind this project, it's just enough to immediately grab your attention. You have Floating Points, a UK producer who is one of the newer big names in the IDM and progressive electronic scene. Then you have the legendary saxophone player Pharoah, who has been doing albums from like the late 60s. He has some significant classics in his back catalog and he's also one of the pioneers in the spiritual jazz scene. And finally, you have London Symphony Orchestra. This combination by itself is enough to really intrigue you and grab your attention, and you're obviously going to be curious how the result of this is going to be. And this is a beautiful combination of old and new sounds, and you basically have electronic music and jazz and classical all in one piece. What was actually unexpected for me though is that getting into this piece, I expected that this album was going to be really complex, something that would constantly change and would not just stay in the same patterns, but we're talking about the exact opposite. This entire album is just based on one simple chord progression that just goes on for the entirety of this album, and we're talking about sort of like 45-minute album. There is the same chord progression repeated throughout this entire project, and it's separated in 9 different movements. The great things come from all of the sounds in between this simple chord progression, where you would have improvised jazz pieces and grand orchestral themes, and all of them would just make for some awesome combinations of sounds coming together. One of the greatest things about this album is its sound. When it comes to the production, this album just sounds spectacular. Everything feels so detailed. There is just a perfect balance between all of those sounds. And when it comes to the performances, this thing is top notch. The leading melody by itself that carries throughout this entire project, it's simple, but it's so soothing and infectious. And just for how simple it is, it just gets the job done in a marvelous way. And whether we're talking about the sax solos of Pharoah or the magnificent string sections of the London Symphony Orchestra, every single thing is just performed masterfully. As a whole thing, this album is beautiful and is captivating, but there were occasions where the album might actually lose me. There were some certain movements that did not captivate me as much compared to others. So for me, as far as I can praise this album for hours, this is not a perfect album for me. I would not consider this a masterpiece, and I wouldn't even consider it my favorite release of 2021, not by a chance. This album, in my opinion, has some certain movements that didn't really do that much for me. This is because in certain occasions I feel that the album does not really have that much of a variation in order to justify for a separate movement. It would make much more of a sense if some of the movements would be compiled together into one, making for some lengthier tracks that would just fit more into the theme. And that's what I feel it is a case between the movements 2 till 5. These movements, in my opinion, do not do something all that different. Their pace is slow and the changes are minor. In my opinion, the album makes a beautiful introduction with movement 1. It just introduces you beautifully into this whole aesthetic, and the saxophone solos are magnificent. Then you get into movement 2 where you kinda sense a bit of a difference as you see the piece progressing and just adding a few string sections that are just really low into the mix and just adding a bit to the experience, but it's a really short movement that doesn't really develop all that much into movement 3. When it comes to movement 4, it's another really short piece where the only thing that feels like it's added is some hummings from Pharoah Sanders, just giving a sort of spiritual jazz feel, which is a really nice touch, but it's another movement that feels really short without having that much to it to just really captivate me or just make it stand out as a movement. We get into movement 5 where this is the album sort of seems like it tries to pick up a bit more and just become slightly more intense in certain portions. But again, it's not something really that much significant, which then leads us to the movement 6, which in my opinion, this is the magnum opus of this project. This is the most significant piece, because this is where the album really shifts its sound and presents what I would consider one of my favorite musical pieces of 2021. Movement 6 is paced and performed in an excellent manner. It starts with a sax solo, but then you quickly get into the part where the London Symphony Orchestra plays its part and completely steals the show, putting so many string layers on top of each other and just constantly progressing, only to just explode in a grand finale that just simply sounds overwhelming and marvelous. And with this particular movement is where the album shifts into so many different emotions. For the most part, the first half of the album was mainly soothing, but with the movement 6, it suddenly gets intense, and in other occasions it feels sad, and in other occasions it feels haunting, and it makes for so many different emotions just compiled together and just fused so magnificently in this piece. And it also nicely fuses with the lead chords the entire time. It's not like they feel like two separate worlds, and even when the strings take the leading role, the track never loses its identity. This is an excellent song. With movement 7, things calm down a bit once again. We're mainly getting the main melody and some more soothing moments, but then you quickly realize that this is the moment where the album kinda goes into the more messy and more chaotic approaches, as with movement 7 we get some free improvised electronic pieces, and this is where you might have the main melody that would carry the previous rest of the album not playing that much of the leading role and actually having some of the free improvised pieces take place, and in some cases it becomes chaotic, especially when it fuses with some solo saxophone portions of Pharoah Sanders, and it makes for a really special piece that also makes for one of my favorites in the album. Movement is where you feel that the album goes to its climax, but instead of ending in a really grand and intense note, it actually decides to end in its most minimal and soothing tone. And this is not a bad thing, but the track really lost me in its second half, where it would have this church organ take place in some portions and the main melody being abandoned. And the thing is that in some places you have complete silence and it takes for a while to just offer a new sound and just hear something. And me personally, it puts me a bit off because I would prefer for the climax to just be a more soothing conclusion. When it has all of those silent portions, it just fills me with confusion and it just takes away from what the rest of the album was just creating up until all this point. And then finally the album ends with movement 9, which is not the kind of ending that I was expecting and the type of ending that I wanted. It ends with a really beautiful string piece from the London Symphony Orchestra that has so many great layers of classical instrumentation that just sounds gorgeous. But this is where the album sort of feels like it kinda separates itself from everything that was building up until this point, and I wouldn't have that much of an issue with it if this final classical piece wasn't that short-lived. It was only 2.5 minutes, and the portion from the beginning and the end of the song is actually silent, so it doesn't leave me to that much of a content, and when it starts to pick up and lead somewhere, then it ends, and I certainly wanted more out of this track for just making a really touching conclusion. So despite my huge appreciation from those three words coming together, this album for me is flawed. As a whole thing, there were certain portions and certain movements that I didn't see myself enjoying as much compared to others. And it's a shame because in some occasions this album offers some of the greatest moments I've heard in music all year. Movement 6 is absolutely mind-blowing, but as a whole thing, some of the movements, in my opinion, there could have been more out of them. But still, for what it is, I'm not complaining. This album feels significant to me, despite its flaws. I'm glad that this collaboration exists, and I'm glad that I gave it a chance. This is certainly an experience, and an album that fans of music in general should not miss. I'm going to give Promises a 7+ out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.